Today I'd like to conclude our journey in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, with the story of the vineyard and what happens in this vineyard. And as we engage in this story, let us just take a moment to thank Jesus for the gift of his life, to thank Jesus for his devotion to his mission, to thank Jesus for his faithfulness. Jesus, we thank you for the way that you lead us, the way you embrace us, the way you show us how to love. So in this story of the vineyard, the owner of the vineyard wants to get his grapes from the tenants. They're resisting. And all of these servants that are sent, they abuse them, they treat them horribly. So finally, he says, well, let me send my son. They will have reverence for my son. But they seize the son, we find out in verse 39, and they throw him out of the vineyard, and they kill him. The idea of throwing the son out of the vineyard is kind of paralleled with Jesus, in the sense of Jesus dying technically outside the gates of Jerusalem. At Calvary, the hill was outside the gates. And this reference to throwing him out of the vineyard is not found in Mark, but Matthew picks up on this to kind of emphasize how Jesus dies, where Jesus dies. So in verse 40, the question is posed. Well, what will the owner of the vineyard do to these tenants when he comes? And the answer in verse 41 is he will put those wretched men to a wretched death and lease his vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the proper times. Of course, we learned earlier that the produce refers to the good works that we do in terms of following God. Very interestingly here, who answers the question? The question is answered in Matthew's telling of it by the Jewish leaders. And in a way, we might say they are sort of condemning themselves, because they are saying that, well, if you don't recognize the Son, if you don't acknowledge the Son, if you don't treat the Son with reverence, if you don't respect the owner of the vineyard, then you should not be treated well. And not only not being treated well, but they take it a little bit further. They say, well, put them to a wretched death. They're wretched men. They're terrible. Look what they did to the son. Look what they did to the servants. It's just a terrible thing that they did. So they should be put to death. And then other tenants will come in and take the place of those tenants who did not act too well. And of course, in the parallel, who are these other tenants? The other tenants become the Gentiles, those who are of a different faith persuasion. Jesus then continues to engage in the dialogue with them in rabbinic fashion and says, well, did you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? And by the Lord this has been done, and it is wonderful in our eyes. So this Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23, was used in the early church as a prophecy of the resurrection. We see it in Acts chapter 4, verse 11, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. So it's about rejection, but then that rejection leads to this new foundation, this cornerstone. So what Matthew seems to be saying here is, yeah, Jesus might have been rejected by the leaders, but that's really not the end of the story. That rejection is part of it, certainly, The leaders did not accept Jesus as Messiah. They thought Jesus was sort of a troublemaker. They wanted to get rid of him, obviously. He was too challenging, maybe, to their authority. Um, for whatever reason, they decide, let's make sure that Jesus is no longer a problem for us. So Jesus is killed. He's crucified. Certainly not by the Jewish leaders. We have to make that clear. The crucifixion was carried out by the Romans. We can say at the urging of the leadership, but it was the Romans who did it. And of course, there's that old contention, who is to blame for the death of Jesus? And Church teaches clearly it certainly is not the Jewish people. It is certain individuals, but certainly not the Jewish people as a whole. That's really off-base notion. I mean, the Jewish people as a whole had nothing to do with the death of Jesus whatsoever. But it's not so much the focus here on the death as it is on the cornerstone. What becomes the building block for the church? It's not so much about rejection, this particular psalm. It's about building. What are you going to build? What type of church, what type of community will you build? Will it be a loving community? Will it be a caring community? Will it be a community of resurrection, a community of joy? Not a community caught in the past, but a community living in the present and loving in the present. In verse 43, then, we hear, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that will produce its fruit." So who are the people that will produce the fruit? It's certainly many of the Jewish people who were the earliest followers of Jesus. It is then extended to the Gentiles and in true fashion, in terms of the Hebrew Scriptures, to all nations. Certainly Isaiah talks about God's plan for all nations, all peoples. And so these become the people who will produce fruit. So it's interesting when you look at that criteria. People produce fruit not so much by what they say. What Jesus is pointing to here is, what type of life do they live? Do they live a life of caring, of compassion, of love for others? Do they put others first? That is the people who produce fruit. And those are the people in the kingdom, the people who make a difference in the lives of others by their works of charity, by their works of love, by feeding the hungry, by giving clothes to the naked, by giving homes to those who are homeless, visiting the sick. These are the things that produce the fruit. And they are the people of the kingdom. Then there's a verse that seems to be taken from Luke, chapter 20, verse 18, that Matthew puts in. "The one who falls on this stone will be dashed to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." So the idea of getting confused and falling and misrepresenting yourself, and this can lead to, obviously, destruction, can lead to danger. So be careful with what you say, what you do. Be true to the good news. Be true to the message of the Scriptures, or else that rock, you can fall on that rock, and that rock would represent scandal, certainly scandal on the idea of falling on the rock. So the cornerstone can lead to much good fruit. The cornerstone is a sign of resurrection. It's a sign of joy. But like any stone, we have to be careful, because we can stumble, we can fall, we can get confused, we can become selfish and egotistical. And so we have to be careful. Now in verse 45, it says, "Well, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they knew that he was speaking about them. Interestingly, Matthew inserts the Pharisees into the group of Jewish leaders. The Pharisees would not have been in the leadership group historically, but they would have been more prominent during the time when Matthew was writing the gospel in the 70s and 80s and 90s. The Pharisees would have assumed a more prominent position because of the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they would be turned to more in terms of their leadership because the Sanhedrin was gone and the temple was gone. So there was a need for leadership, and the Pharisees would have assumed that role, but certainly at the time of Jesus, they would have not been in a leadership position. And then in verse 46, it says, and although they were attempting to arrest him, they feared the crowds, for they regarded him as a prophet. So again, this fear of arresting Jesus comes in, and this is kind of leading us into the passion narrative, which we're going to get into in a few sessions down the road, because this is a setup, the whole idea of, the looking for Jesus, trying to arrest Jesus is featured here. So let us thank Jesus, certainly, for his faithfulness. Let us thank Jesus for pointing us in the direction where we should go, direction of being loving people, producing good fruit. And let us resolve, each in our own way, to try to produce a good harvest. God bless.